The autumn of 1826 descended upon the James River Valley in eastern Virginia with an unusual chill, frost appearing weeks earlier than normal and catching plantation owners unprepared for a winter that would test their carefully maintained operations. In the slave quarters of Belmont Estate, just outside Richmond, household servants gathered in the kitchen after the main house had gone dark and spoke in voices carefully modulated to avoid detection, discussing a recent arrival whose physical presence had already disrupted routines that had remained unchanged for decades. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another enslaved person being absorbed into the elaborate hierarchies that governed Virginia's oldest plantation households. This was someone whose extraordinary size would expose the fragility of domestic service arrangements that slaveholders claimed represented the most refined and civilized form of human bondage. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 3 years would become a story preserved in oral traditions across the Upper South, a tale of how household control, supposedly maintained through training and proximity rather than crude violence, could unravel completely when confronted with someone whose very existence challenged every assumption about power, deference, and the possibility of rendering human beings invisible while they performed intimate labor in close quarters with those who claimed to own them. Virginia in the mid-1820s occupied a peculiar and painful position in the geography of American slavery, a state whose economic foundations had shifted dramatically from its colonial origins as the wealthiest tobacco-producing region in North America. The soil that had generated fortunes for generations had been exhausted through intensive cultivation, forcing planters to either shift to less profitable wheat and mixed agriculture, or to recognize that their most valuable asset was no longer land but the enslaved people who worked it. This recognition had transformed Virginia into the primary source of enslaved labor for the domestic slave trade, with an estimated 300,000 people sold south and west between 1790 and 1860 as the state became what some historians would later describe as a breeding farm for the expanding Cotton Kingdom. Richmond had emerged as a major center for this commerce in human beings, with slave markets operating openly near the docks where James River met the Chesapeake, their advertisements in local newspapers discussing people with the casual commercial language used for livestock, reducing human beings to itemized lists of skills and estimated productive value. The society that maintained this system operated through mechanisms that differed significantly from plantation slavery in the Deep South, with a much higher proportion of enslaved people working in domestic service, skilled trades, and urban occupations rather than gang labor in agricultural fields. Virginia slaveholders, particularly those from the old Tidewater aristocracy, prided themselves on their refined approach to human bondage, claiming that generations of experience had created a system more humane and sophisticated than the brutal cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama. They pointed to elaborate household hierarchies where enslaved people held positions of apparent authority and responsibility, to lower rates of physical punishment compared to Deep South operations, to the literacy that some household servants acquired, despite laws forbidding it. But this self-image obscured a reality that was oppressive in its own distinctive ways. Domestic service meant constant surveillance and invasion of privacy that field workers sometimes escaped. Proximity to slaveholding families meant intimate exposure to their moral corruption and casual cruelty. And the ever-present threat of sale south transformed every interaction into a desperate performance of compliance designed to avoid being torn from family and community and sent to places where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery reflected both the state's long history with the institution and its growing anxiety about maintaining control as the enslaved population approached 500,000 people by 1830. The slave code was among the most comprehensive in the South, developed through 2 centuries of legislative refinements that attempted to address every conceivable challenge to white supremacy and slaveholder authority. Enslaved people were defined as absolute property subject to their owners' complete control, yet also recognized as persons for purposes of criminal prosecution when convenient for maintaining social order. Free black people existed in Virginia in larger numbers than in most slaveholding states, perhaps 30,000 by 1830. But under crushing restrictions that required registration with county courts, prohibited certain occupations and movements, and subjected them to constant surveillance by patrols authorized to question anyone who appeared to be of African descent about their legal status. Into this world of codified oppression disguised as aristocratic refinement, of household service presented as evidence of slavery's civilized character, came someone who would demonstrate that domestic control was as illusory as field discipline when confronted with an individual whose physical presence made the usual mechanisms of power impossible to sustain. Stories passed down through generations claim that Kwasi arrived at Belmont Estate in September 1826, purchased at a Richmond slave market from a Maryland trader who had acquired him as part of an estate liquidation following the death of a planter near Annapolis. The sale that brought Kwasi to market had included 32 people, families systematically broken apart and sold to different buyers as the auctioneer worked through his inventory with the practiced efficiency of any commercial operation. But from the moment Kwasi stood on the auction block in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom Market, where thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold annually in transactions that generated substantial revenue for the city through licensing fees and taxes, he commanded attention that transcended the routine evaluations occurring around him. Standing 7 feet and 6 inches tall, with a frame that suggested both tremendous strength and a kind of natural dignity that no amount of degrading ritual could fully suppress, he literally towered over the auctioneers and potential buyers who circled him with expressions mixing commercial interest with visible unease about exactly what they were looking at and what his presence might mean for the careful social arrangements they depended upon. Oral histories indicate that Kwasi's appearance generated immediate controversy among potential buyers, with several explicitly refusing to bid despite his obvious physical capabilities and the skills in carpentry and mechanical work that the trader emphasized. The auctioneer's disclosure that Kwasi had been employed in household service in Maryland, that he possessed literacy unusual for enslaved people, and had worked in positions requiring both intelligence and trustworthiness, should have increased his value in Virginia's labor market, where such capabilities commanded premium prices for domestic positions. But his extraordinary height created concerns that multiple planters voiced openly during the pre-auction inspection. How could someone so physically imposing be safely employed in household service where he would be in constant proximity to white family members, where his presence might disturb the careful hierarchies that made domestic slavery psychologically tolerable for those it served, where his very visibility would make it impossible to maintain the fiction that good servants were essentially invisible extensions of their owner's will with no independent existence worthy of acknowledgement? The winning bidder was Catherine Randolph, widow of a prominent Virginia planter who had died 2 years earlier, leaving her in control of Belmont Estate and its complex operations. She paid an extraordinary sum, $1,900, for Kwasi, a price that reflected both his documented skills and her particular needs for someone who could manage the heavy household maintenance that Belmont's aging infrastructure required, while also potentially serving in more visible domestic roles that would demonstrate the estate's continued prosperity despite obvious economic decline. Mrs. Randolph purchased Kwasi with specific intentions that revealed both her practical calculation and her profound misunderstanding of what she had actually acquired. She planned to employ him in mixed roles that would maximize return on her expensive investment: carpentry and mechanical repairs that his size and strength made him uniquely capable of performing, but also potentially as a butler or footman whose extraordinary height would make dramatic impression on visitors and prove that Belmont remained among Virginia's premier estates, despite the economic transformations undermining the Tidewater aristocracy's traditional foundations. What Mrs. Randolph failed to anticipate, what her confidence in Virginia's supposedly refined household service traditions prevented her from recognizing, was that she had purchased someone whose physical presence would make traditional domestic arrangements impossible to maintain according to the scripts that generations of Tidewater slaveholders had developed. Kwasi's height meant he couldn't move through spaces designed for normal-sized people without constant awareness of his extraordinariness, couldn't perform duties in the background as good household servants were supposed to do, couldn't be rendered invisible in the ways that made domestic service psychologically sustainable for white families who depended on being served by people they simultaneously claimed to care for, paternalistically, while treating as property that could be sold at any moment. Every time he entered a room, his presence dominated it completely, forcing recognition and acknowledgement that undermined the careful fiction of enslaved people as mere instruments of their owner's comfort, with no independent existence or agency worth recognizing. The rhythm of life at Belmont Estate followed patterns established through generations of Tidewater plantation operations, elaborate routines that distinguished between field workers who labored in declining wheat cultivation and the extensive household staff who maintained the main residence and served the Randolph family according to protocols that supposedly demonstrated Virginia slavery's superior refinement. The main house, a Georgian mansion built in the 1740s when tobacco money still flowed freely, and Virginia's aristocracy seemed unassailable, required constant maintenance, and operated according to hierarchies as complex as any European noble household. At the top stood Mrs. Randolph's personal servants, ladies' maids and valets who attended to intimate needs and whose positions required both skill and the kind of trust that developed only through years of careful training. Below them came the household staff proper, butlers and footmen, cooks and kitchen workers, housemaids and laundresses, each with specific duties and understood status relative to others in the domestic hierarchy. At the bottom, though still well above field workers in the estate's social structure, came those assigned to heavy household labor, maintenance workers, stable hands, those who performed the physically demanding tasks that kept the estate functioning, but who rarely entered the family's presence. Kwasi worked in this environment from his first day at Belmont, initially assigned to carpentry and mechanical repair work that kept him primarily in outbuildings, workshops, and areas of the house, undergoing renovation or maintenance. But scattered documents hint that from the very beginning, his presence created complications that neither Mrs. Randolph nor her household manager knew how to resolve within traditional frameworks of domestic control. His extraordinary height made even simple movements through the house problematic in ways that went far beyond physical logistics. Doorways built for normal-sized people required him to duck his head and turn sideways, creating awkward passages that looked undignified and somehow threatening to witnesses accustomed to servants moving with practiced grace. Staircases forced him into crouching that emphasized his size rather than minimizing it, made him appear even more physically imposing rather than allowing him to fade into background as household service protocols demanded. His footsteps on wooden floors sounded impossibly loud, announcing his presence and making stealth impossible in ways that violated every principle of good domestic service. Local tradition holds that the first serious crisis occurred within a month of Kwasi's arrival, during what should have been a routine task that instead exposed fundamental contradictions in employing someone his size in household service. Mrs. Randolph had ordered repairs to the main parlor's ceiling, work that required accessing heights that would normally demand scaffolding and multiple workers. She assigned Kwasi to the project, calculating that his extraordinary height would allow him to perform alone what would otherwise require elaborate preparation and significant expense. The carpentry work itself proceeded smoothly. Kwasi possessed obvious skill and worked with efficiency that pleased the household manager supervising the project. But when Mrs. Randolph entered the parlor to inspect progress, she found herself confronted with a sight that disturbed her in ways she initially struggled to articulate. Kwasi stood on a low platform reaching toward the ceiling, his massive frame dominating the elegant space, his head nearly touching decorative moldings that were supposed to be far above human reach, his very presence transforming the room from a showcase of refined taste into something that felt almost primitive or barbaric through the jarring contrast between delicate aristocratic decor and this giant figure working within it. What happened in that moment, according to oral histories, crystallized tensions that would define Kwasi's entire time at Belmont and create ripples extending far beyond the estate's boundaries. Mrs. Randolph ordered Kwasi to stop working and leave the room immediately, her tone sharp with an emotion that seemed like fear, though she would have denied that characterization. But in giving that order, she inadvertently acknowledged that his presence disrupted the careful aesthetics and social arrangements that made domestic service psychologically tolerable for Virginia's slave-holding aristocracy. That his size made him fundamentally incompatible with spaces designed to demonstrate refined civilization. Word of the incident spread through networks of household servants who worked at neighboring estates, and through gossip among the planter families who maintained social connections across the Tidewater region. For enslaved communities, the tale became evidence that even the most carefully controlled household operations contained vulnerabilities that extraordinary individuals could expose. For slaveholding families, the story generated anxious conversations about whether employing someone like Kwasi in domestic service represented a dangerous precedent that challenged assumptions about the compatibility of slavery with refined civilization. By winter of 1827, fragmentary records suggest that Mrs. Randolph had begun to recognize that her expensive purchase might have been a catastrophic miscalculation, that Kwasi's qualities made him fundamentally unsuitable for the domestic roles she had envisioned, despite his obvious capabilities. She attempted to restrict him to maintenance work that kept him away from family spaces and visiting guests, essentially treating him as a skilled laborer who happened to live in the household quarters, rather than as a true domestic servant. But this created its own problems that exposed contradictions in her entire investment strategy. Kwasi's skills were too valuable to waste on simple manual labor, and confining his movements meant limiting his ability to perform the very tasks that justified his high purchase price. More troublingly, from Mrs. Randolph's perspective, restricting Kwasi to certain areas inadvertently created spaces where he operated with unusual autonomy, areas where household surveillance was less intense, and where he could interact with other enslaved workers without the constant monitoring that domestic service normally imposed. Whispered tales speak of Kwasi using this relative freedom to help other enslaved people at Belmont in ways that were subtle enough to avoid provoking response, but significant enough to materially improve lives lived under systematic oppression. When performing repairs in the slave quarters, he would make improvements beyond what was strictly necessary, reinforcing structures to provide better protection from weather, creating storage spaces that gave people more control over their few possessions, building furniture that made cramped cabins slightly more livable. He would share his literacy with others who wanted to learn, teaching reading and writing in stolen moments when supervision was minimal, knowing that this violated Virginia law, but calculating that the risks were worth taking to provide people with skills that might someday prove valuable. He became a kind of informal counselor to household servants struggling with the particular psychological strains of domestic service, offering perspective and support that helped people maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away through constant intimate contact with those who claimed ownership. Most significantly, Kwasi's physical presence seemed to moderate the behavior of white household managers and family members in ways that no one explicitly acknowledged, but everyone noticed. The housekeeper, who normally administered casual slaps and verbal abuse to servants who displeased her, became noticeably more controlled when Kwasi was nearby, as if his size generated unconscious hesitation about engaging in violence where he might witness or intervene. The Randolph sons, young men in their 20s who had reputations for harassing female household servants, seemed to avoid certain areas of the estate when Kwasi worked there, as if his presence created an unspoken barrier against the worst predations that household service exposed women to. None of this was dramatic enough to constitute open protection or direct challenge to white authority, but cumulatively it created an atmosphere at Belmont that differed from traditional plantation households in ways that both enslaved people and slave-holding family members recognized, even if they couldn't quite articulate. The spring of 1827 brought developments that demonstrated just how widely Kwasi's reputation had spread beyond Belmont and how uncomfortable it made Virginia's Tidewater aristocracy, who prided themselves on their refined approach to domestic slavery. According to some accounts, visitors to the estate began specifically requesting to see the giant servant, treating Kwasi like an attraction they expected Mrs. Randolph to display for their entertainment and curiosity. This attention created impossible dilemmas for a widow trying to maintain her social position among Virginia's oldest families through careful management of appearances and traditional hospitality. Displaying Kwasi satisfied visitors' curiosity and demonstrated that Belmont could still afford expensive acquisitions, proving the estate remained viable despite economic decline, threatening the entire Tidewater region. But the nature of the attention suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the situation, that household service wasn't supposed to include someone so extraordinary that he became a topic of fascinated conversation rather than fading into proper servant invisibility. Local tradition holds that Mrs. Randolph attempted to resolve this paradox through a series of increasingly desperate measures that revealed both her limited options and the fundamental impossibility of incorporating Kwasi into traditional domestic service structures. She ordered him to avoid being seen by visitors whenever possible, to work only in areas of the estate where guests wouldn't encounter him unexpectedly. But this proved impractical given his maintenance responsibilities and the house's layout. And the attempts at concealment actually generated more interest as visitors noticed his absence and wondered why such an extraordinary person was being hidden. She considered employing him as a footman at formal dinners, reasoning that his height would create impressive visual impact in controlled settings. But trial runs of this arrangement demonstrated it was unworkable. Guests found his presence so distracting that conversations faltered, and his size made him dominate dining rooms in ways that undermined rather than enhanced the elegant atmosphere Mrs. Randolph worked hard to maintain. She thought about selling Kwasi to eliminate the problem, but doing so would mean admitting the purchase had been a mistake and taking a substantial financial loss that her precarious economic position couldn't easily absorb. More importantly, selling him would confirm to Virginia's gossip-prone aristocracy that she had lost control of her own household, that she lacked the management skills that supposedly distinguished superior families from lesser planters. She considered restricting him exclusively to fieldwork, but this would waste his valuable skills and represent a kind of defeat. Acknowledgement that household service couldn't accommodate someone who challenged its basic assumptions about control, hierarchy, and the possibility of rendering servants invisible while they performed intimate labor. By summer of 1827, scattered documents hint that tensions at Belmont had escalated in ways that made some kind of crisis inevitable. That contradictions inherent in Quasi's position had become unsustainable for everyone involved. Mrs. Randolph's household manager, a free black woman named Judith, who had worked at the estate for 3 decades and who managed household servants through combination of detailed instruction and strategic deployment of her authority, reported increasing difficulty maintaining proper discipline and deference. She claimed that other household servants had become less subservient since Quasi's arrival, more willing to question orders or perform duties according to their own judgment, rather than following instructions exactly. Judith attributed this change to Quasi's influence, though she couldn't point to specific acts of encouragement or organized resistance. The problem was atmospheric, a general shift in household dynamics that made traditional control mechanisms less effective. Oral histories claim that the crisis came to a head in August 1827, during an incident that would become legendary among enslaved communities throughout Virginia, and that would haunt the Randolph family for years afterward. According to these accounts, one of Mrs. Randolph's sons, sources differ on whether it was the eldest, Thomas, or the middle son, William, made unwanted advances toward a young woman who worked as a housemaid, following her into a storage room where she had gone to retrieve linens. This kind of predation was unfortunately common in plantation households, one of the many horrors that domestic service exposed women to with no legal recourse or protection. But on this occasion, local tradition holds that Quasi happened to be working nearby on repairs to adjacent rooms. When he heard sounds of struggle and distress, he entered the storage room to find the young Randolph man attempting to force himself on the terrified housemaid. What happened next became the subject of endless speculation and varying accounts, but certain elements remained consistent across different tellings. Quasi didn't attack the white man. Doing so would have meant certain death and probably execution of other enslaved people as collective punishment. Instead, he simply stood in the doorway blocking exit, his massive frame filling the space completely, and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Randolph is looking for you. She sent me to find you. She's waiting in the main parlor." The words were respectful, phrased as helpful information rather than accusation or threat. But the implication was clear. Quasi had witnessed what was happening, and his presence meant the attempted assault couldn't continue unobserved and unprevented. The young Randolph man, confronted with someone whose size made physical intimidation impossible, and whose intervention created witnesses to behavior that violated even slaveholders' claimed paternalistic standards, left the storage room without accomplishing his intent. The housemaid escaped assault, though not the trauma of what had almost happened. The consequences of this intervention cascaded through Belmont and beyond in ways that exposed every contradiction at the heart of Virginia's household service traditions. The young woman Quasi had protected told other household servants what had happened, and word spread through enslaved communities with the speed that information always traveled when it involved successful resistance to predation that normally went unpunished. For enslaved people, particularly women who lived in constant fear of sexual violence that slavery's power dynamics made almost impossible to prevent, the story became proof that protection was sometimes possible, that someone with sufficient physical presence and strategic courage could intervene in ways that saved others from the worst horrors of household service. The tale took on significance far beyond a single prevented assault, becoming evidence that slaveholders' power had limits, that their claimed paternalistic care for enslaved people was hollow fiction when convenient, that resistance could take forms besides open rebellion or desperate flight. For the Randolph family, the incident generated a crisis that threatened Mrs. Randolph's carefully maintained reputation and her son's standing among Virginia's aristocracy. If the story became widely known in white society, it would expose the family to scandal, acknowledging that their household was so poorly controlled that enslaved servants could witness and prevent white family members' actions, suggested fundamental failures of management and authority. But attempting to punish Quasi for interfering would require explaining why punishment was justified, making the attempted assault public knowledge. Mrs. Randolph found herself trapped between impossible options. unable to restore proper hierarchies without confirming that those hierarchies had been violated in ways that reflected badly on her family's character and her own capacity for household management. Local tradition holds that Mrs. Randolph chose to handle the situation through strategic silence, never explicitly acknowledging what had happened, never punishing Kwasi, never discussing the incident with her sons, but quietly restructuring household assignments to ensure the young woman Kwasi had protected worked in areas where she would have more supervision and less vulnerability to predation. This response was probably the most pragmatic available given the circumstances, but it represented a fundamental concession that household control was incomplete, that enslaved servants could exercise agency in ways that affected white family members' behavior, that the supposedly absolute power slaveholders claimed existed only as long as enslaved people cooperated in maintaining the fiction. Other household servants noticed these changes and understood their significance, recognizing that Kwasi's intervention had created consequences that altered Belmont's operations in subtle but meaningful ways. By fall of 1827, fragmentary records suggest that word of the incident had spread well beyond Belmont, despite the Randolph family's attempts at discretion, creating conversations among Virginia's Tidewater aristocracy that mixed fascination with deep anxiety about implications few wanted to examine directly. Other planters expressed concern that Mrs. Randolph's failure to punish Kwasi for interfering with her son set dangerous precedents, that allowing any enslaved person to insert themselves into white family matters, even to prevent behavior that violated claimed paternalistic values, threatened the entire system's stability. Some suggested she should sell Kwasi immediately, regardless of financial loss, that eliminating his influence was more important than preserving property value. Others recognized that the situation exposed contradictions inherent in household slavery itself. The system required enslaved people to be present during families' most intimate moments, to possess enough intelligence and initiative to manage complex domestic operations, but those very qualities enabled them to witness and potentially intervene in ways that challenged white supremacy's claims of absolute authority and moral superiority. The winter of 1828 brought unexpected developments that suggested Kwasi's situation had become untenable for all parties, despite the various accommodations that had been attempted. According to some accounts, he was sold in January 1828 to a Richmond merchant who intended to employ him in commercial operations rather than household service, work where his size and skills would be valuable assets, and where the dynamics of control that plagued domestic arrangements would be less relevant. Other stories claim that Kwasi simply disappeared one night, vanishing from Belmont with a completeness that suggested either escape to freedom or secret sale arranged to avoid public acknowledgement of Mrs. Randolph's failure to maintain proper household authority. A few oral histories even suggest that the Randolph family arranged for Kwasi's escape, recognizing that his continued presence would generate ongoing scandals, and that helping him flee was preferable to the persistent crisis his existence created for their reputation and household operations. What happened to Kwasi after leaving or escaping from Belmont remains one of those historical mysteries that generates endless speculation across different versions preserved in oral tradition. Some claim he made it to Pennsylvania and eventually to Canada, using networks of free Black people and sympathetic Quakers to navigate the dangerous journey through regions where slave catchers operated with legal impunity. Others suggest he remained in Richmond, working as a supposedly free laborer, using forged papers that somehow withstood scrutiny despite Virginia's increasingly paranoid enforcement of laws, controlling free Black people's movements and requiring documentation of status. A few accounts place him on ships leaving from Richmond or Norfolk, suggesting he went to sea where his status would be ambiguous, and his capabilities would make him valuable enough that captains asked few questions about backgrounds or legal documentation. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the deliberate gaps and silences that characterized historical records of enslaved people who refused to accept their status as permanent or inevitable. What is documented is the impact Kwasi's story had on conversations about household slavery in Virginia and across the Upper South in the years following his disappearance from Belmont. Slaveholders who had prided themselves on their refined approach to human bondage, who had distinguished their supposedly civilized domestic service from the brutal field operations of cotton plantations, found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about control and its limits. If someone like Kwasi could disrupt even the most carefully managed household through simple physical presence and strategic intervention to protect others, what did that suggest about the stability of the entire system? If household service created proximity and visibility that could become weapons when extraordinary individuals recognized and deployed them to prevent the worst abuses, perhaps the vaunted refinement of tidewater slavery was actually a vulnerability rather than the advancement that planters claimed. For enslaved communities throughout Virginia and beyond, Quasi's story became part of a larger tradition of resistance narratives that preserved knowledge about power and its vulnerabilities across generations. Household servants spoke of the giant who couldn't be controlled, whose very presence had disrupted careful hierarchies that domestic slavery depended upon, who had achieved a measure of autonomy and used it to protect others from violence that the system claimed didn't exist or wasn't significant. The story took on mythical dimensions in some tellings, attributing to Quasi acts of intervention and protection that might have been elaborations, but served essential purposes for communities desperate for examples of successful resistance. In the most optimistic versions, he became a figure who not only escaped, but who helped others flee, a giant who moved through the night, liberating people from bondage. In more somber tellings, he remained a symbol of dignity maintained and protection offered, despite systematic attempts to render enslaved people powerless to defend themselves or others. The deeper truth that Quasi's story illuminates transcends the specific details of what did or didn't happen at Belmont Estate between 1826 and 1828. His experience reveals fundamental contradictions that made household slavery as unstable and oppressive as field operations, despite slaveholders' claims about refinement and civilization, distinguishing their approach from cruder forms of exploitation. Domestic service required enslaved people to possess intelligence sufficient to manage complex household operations, to exercise judgment and initiative with minimal supervision, to be trusted with intimate access to white families' daily lives. But those very qualities enabled resistance when individuals recognized their own capacity for agency and chose to exercise it despite risks. Household service created proximity and visibility that was supposed to enable better control through constant surveillance. But for someone like Quasi, that visibility became a weapon that disrupted the careful fictions household slavery depended upon, the fiction that enslaved people could be rendered invisible while performing duties, the fiction that physical presence didn't matter as long as proper deference was maintained, the fiction that control was absolute when it was actually contingent on enslaved people accepting their status rather than challenging it. Quasi's extraordinary height made these contradictions impossible to ignore or obscure through usual mechanisms of household management. His 7'6" frame meant he couldn't be rendered invisible in any space he occupied, couldn't fade into background as good household servants were supposed to do, couldn't perform duties without forcing recognition of his existence as an individual with obvious capabilities and inherent dignity. His physical presence challenged every aesthetic and social arrangement that made domestic service psychologically sustainable for Virginia's aristocracy, creating situations where the usual protocols of refined slavery revealed their arbitrary and oppressive character. When Mrs. Randolph attempted to employ him in visible domestic roles, she discovered that his size disrupted rather than enhanced the elegant atmosphere she worked to maintain. When her son attempted to assault a housemaid, Quasi's intervention demonstrated that household slavery's claimed paternalistic protections were hollow fictions that meant nothing when convenient for white family members to ignore. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about resistance and household service that official documents systematically excluded. Knowledge about how enslaved people maintained dignity and exercised agency, even in spaces designed to strip away both through constant surveillance and demanded deference. How they used whatever advantages circumstances provided to protect themselves and others from the worst violence that proximity to slaveholding families made possible. These oral traditions tell us that domestic workers developed sophisticated understandings of power's psychology, recognizing the difference between actual authority and the performance of authority that household slavery required enslaved people to validate through subservient behavior. They understood that refusing to play assigned roles could disrupt entire systems even without open defiance. That strategic assertions of human worth and protective intervention could create spaces of relative safety within comprehensive oppression. And they preserved stories of individuals like Quasi who embodied these principles, who demonstrated through their own experiences that household slavery's claims of civilized refinement masked relationships of violence and sexual predation that differed only in style rather than substance from the brutal field operations that tidewater planters claimed to despise. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Kwasi's story with documentary precision does not diminish its essential truth or its importance for understanding slavery and resistance in all their complex dimensions. The story carries the weight of lived experience transmitted through communities that understood the particular vulnerabilities and possibilities inherent in household service, that knew which truths could be safely recorded and which had to be preserved in oral traditions operating outside official channels controlled by slaveholders. It speaks to the creative intelligence that enslaved people brought to the fundamental problem of maintaining humanity in systems designed to destroy it, to the countless ways they found to resist and to protect others even when direct confrontation meant death or sail south to worse fates. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story about how power works to preserve narratives serving its interests while erasing evidence of failures, contradictions, and the agency of those it sought to reduce to mere property. The legacy of Kwasi and others like him resonates across American history because it reminds us that slavery in all its forms was always contested, always resisted, always undermined by people who refused to accept the status it tried to impose, regardless of what laws declared or violence attempted to enforce. Every assertion of civilized refinement masked violence and sexual predation that occasionally broke through carefully maintained appearances. Every claim of paternalistic care revealed its hollowness when challenged by individuals willing to intervene despite risks. Every attempt to render enslaved people invisible and subordinate encountered individuals whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions the system depended upon. The enslaved people who worked in household service throughout Virginia and across the South maintained their humanity through countless acts of resistance, both dramatic and subtle, preserved memories and traditions that contradicted official narratives, created communities of mutual support and protection that sustained people through systematic degradation, and made survival possible when the system seemed designed to make it impossible. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that resistance and protection stood 7 feet 6 inches tall, impossible to hide or reduce to proper servant invisibility, generating discomfort and fear in those who claimed absolute control, creating spaces of safety through strategic deployment of physical presence combined with protective intervention, demonstrating that even the most supposedly refined and civilized form of slavery contained contradictions and vulnerabilities that could be exposed and exploited by someone with the vision to see them and the courage to act. Kwasi's presence at Belmont lasted barely more than a year, but his impact rippled through household service operations and enslaved communities across generations, creating stories that inspired others to recognize that the master's power was never as absolute as they claimed. That resistance was possible in forms beyond dramatic escape or violent rebellion. That protection of the vulnerable could succeed when individuals with capacity and courage chose to intervene despite all the risks that household slavery's intimate violence made terrifyingly real. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how people maintained agency under comprehensive control, about how they created meaning and offered protection in circumstances designed to render their lives meaningless and everyone vulnerable, about how they kept alive the dream of dignity and safety even when achievement seemed impossibly distant.